Joining us now, Daniel Ziblatt, who's a professor of government at Harvard University and director of the Transformations of Democracy group at the WZB Berlin Social Science Center, where he studies Europe from the 19th century to the present. He is the author of Conservative Parties and the Birth of Democracy, and his latest book, a New York Times bestseller, co-authored with Steven Livitskty, is How Democracies Die. Welcome to Background Briefing, Daniel Ziblatt.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
Well, thanks for joining us. And our democracy didn't die, but there was a peculiar kind of suicide pact that took place just last week on Friday when 126 House Republicans effectively joined in declaring their own elections invalid in supporting an attempt by the Attorney General of Texas, who himself is under investigations for securities fraud and other federal crimes. It's such an extraordinary thing to watch. What, 2/3 of House Republicans essentially support a coup and do it in a brazen way and for nothing. It absolutely amounted to nothing. But the legacy is there, and the fear is there that 2/3 of the Republicans in the House do not understand or respect the tenets of American democracy. How does it strike you?
Yeah, it is. I agree. It's very frightening. And, I think there's two separate issues you should keep in mind as separate issues. One is the prospects of success of this effort of overturning an election, which I think are extremely limited and basically at this point impossible. I mean, the election was a fair, legitimate election. The electors in the states have now selected who the winner is in each of those states, and it's going to go to the Congress on January 6th to get the final stamp of approval. And at the end of January, President Biden will become president. That's one set of issues. That's the kind of acute crisis, like the kind of the threat of a coup. And I think that threat is at this point is not real. But there is a second threat that in some ways is not an acute threat, but rather is a chronic threat, which is the chronic decay and long-run decline of our democracy. And this is the latest twist and turn in this, and in some ways the most ominous, because in a democracy, if one of the competing parties doesn't accept the results of an election for determining who gets in power, then a democracy is fundamentally broken. So essentially what's happened over the last month and a half or so is that we've seen the Republican Party, and especially President Trump, playing up this issue, this myth that there was a stolen election, shaping Republican public opinion on this. And you now have 70% of Republicans convinced that the election was not fair and legitimate. And this will be a kind of gaping wound, I think, in American democracy going forward. And it fundamentally undermines not only the Biden presidency, but our political system as a whole.
But an attempted coup is in many ways as bad as a successful coup. And what I find really troubling about it is that it's wrapped in the language of democracy. It's an anti-democratic coup wrapped in the language of democracy, of needing to count the votes and stop the steal. So it's quite pernicious in that regard.
Yeah, so when we wrote our book, How Democracies Die, which came out in 2018, we first started thinking of writing the book in 2016. And the thing that set off alarm bells for us, my co-author, Steve Livitskty, and me, was candidate Trump at that debate way back in 2016 saying to Hillary Clinton that he may or may not accept the results of the election. So it's exactly this issue that worried us. And one of the things that, again, motivated us in this book is that, the way that democracies die today all around the world, not just the United States, but all around the world, since the end of the Cold War, is not through military coups and kind of dramatic seizures of power, but much more at the ballot box, through constitutional systems, through established political institutions. And so it often happens in a way that voters don't quite understand what's happening. So if the survey result that I often like to cite is in Venezuela, quite a ways into Hugo Chavez's presidency, long after Venezuela was no longer a democracy, a high percentage of Venezuelans, a majority of Venezuelans, still thought they lived in a democracy. And so I think it's quite normal in our current age, given the kind of prevalence of democratic discourse, to use democratic discourse to justify undemocratic measures. And so one can't be fooled by the rhetoric. One has to really look at, is this an effort to enfranchise people or disenfranchise people. If it's an effort to enfranchise, expand the voting base of who's determining our political outcomes, then that's democratic. If you're trying to restrict who has the right to vote, then that's undemocratic. So you can't be fooled by the language. You have to look at the behavior.
And again, I'm speaking with Daniel Ziblatt, who's a professor of government at Harvard University and the director of the Transformations to Democracy group at the WZB Berlin Social Science Center, where he studies Europe in the 19th century to the present. He's the author of Conservative Parties and the Birth of Democracy, and his latest book is a New York Times bestseller, co-authored with Steven Livitskty, is How Democracies Die. Now, Representative Bill Pascrell, a Democrat of New Jersey, has called on House Speaker Nancy Pelosi not to seat those representatives, those 126 Republicans, and bar them from the House because they have violated the Constitution by seeking to overturn a valid democratic election. Now, that probably won't fly, but there were demonstrations on Saturday in New York and around the country. In fact, somebody was shot at a demonstration in Olympia, Washington. In Washington, D.C., the pro-Trump Stop the Steal crowd, who the brief National Security Advisor Michael Flynn addressed them, they were also infiltrated heavily by the Proud Boys and other right-wing groups, and there was an exchange of insults with Black Lives Matter protests. But the thing that's troubling, not just this anti-democratic push on the part of Republicans, and then, by the way, it's the Republican leadership in the House. It's Kevin McCarthy and Steve Scalise who joined in this anti-democratic coup attempt. What troubles me, Daniel, in terms of what's happening to the discourse in this country is when you've got people like Eamon Bundy showing up with guns in front of the homes of local government officials in Idaho who were simply trying to have a meeting about whether or not to have a mandate to wear masks in this pandemic. They were intimidated and their children were intimidated. How much should we tolerate as a society the fact that we now have discourse in this country at the point of a gun with no sanctions against it?
Yeah, we should not tolerate it. It's outrageous. It's beyond the pale. I mean, I think, the groups that are threatening violence. I mean, well, there's 2 points here. Groups that are actively promoting violence and engaging in violence. I mean, the FBI should be investigating them. I mean, this is why we have this is why we have the rule of law. And a democratic society can't survive with groups going around threatening people, intimidating people at the point of a gun. People sometimes worry about cancel culture and so on, where in polite company you can't say offensive things. That's one thing. It's another thing to be showing up with guns telling people what you think. So, that's really beyond the pale. But I think more generally, what you're pointing to, and the reason that one has to worry about this is if we look back historically, when democracies have really gotten into trouble and when they're on a death spiral, one sees sporadic, disorganized violence, and you see a violent society. So that one of the countries that in historical cases that I study most closely is one of the most extreme cases of this, and so people are often nervous about calling upon it, which is the case of Weimar Germany. Certainly there are a lot of differences. Weimar Germany was a new democracy. The U.S. is an old democracy. A lot of big differences, but those differences shouldn't preclude us from taking some of the warning signs from that experience. And that experience was a case where after World War I, you had German nationalists with a very kind of similar myth that we weren't actually defeated. We didn't actually lose World War I, that we were stabbed in the back by some vague mixture of communists, Jews, and liberals who were traitors to the country. And this myth, people dismiss as, this is just some crazies on the right thinking this. But over time, this myth expanded and you had assassination attempts, you had violent confrontations in the streets. And what all of this does is lowers the immune system of a democracy so that when another economic crisis comes along or a war or something else comes along, the immune system has already been weakened in the democracy. And so I think what violence does is it makes a democracy more vulnerable to outright collapse, in addition to being absolutely outrageous for an unacceptable and something that should be cracked down upon by our rule of law institutions.
Well, apparently the notion amongst Republicans, and this extends, I think, to even more traditional Republicans of your father's and grandfather's generation, the kind of Chamber of Commerce type Republicans. If you recall, back in the 2012 election, Mitt Romney was addressing a private function of Republican donors, and somebody taped his speech at which he referred to the makers and takers, the Republicans being the makers and the Democrats being the takers, that they're all basically parasites. That is a pretty pervasive idea. And Mitt Romney now, of course, is perhaps one of the few, if not the only, Republican senator showing some decency. But nevertheless, it's a pervasive belief system amongst Republicans that a lot of Democratic voters, particularly blacks and Latinos, are simply not worthy of the vote. How do you overturn that? How do you eradicate that anti-democratic belief system?
Well, I think what you're pointing to is really one of the drivers, I think, of this dynamic that we're witnessing today, which is what I think of as, and a lot of people call polarization, which is the deep levels of social division in the United States. And whenever one says polarization, I think in the U.S. context, it's pretty clear also that one has to say that it's asymmetric, that there's a real push to the right. And this isn't me just saying this. I mean, there's actually cross-national data available that comes out of a new research project. I encourage your listeners to look up Varieties of Democracies, an organization based out of Research Institute based out of Sweden. And they've coded countries since 1970 around the world, political parties, and how far right or left, and then also to what degree do they subscribe to democratic norms and condone violence and so on. What one sees is that the Republican Party, which used to be a political party very much of the traditional center-right, I mean, like the German Christian Democrats or the old British Tories, the Republican Party was very much a mainstream center-right party, has since the 1990s increasingly gone off the rails. And in terms of its stances, it now clusters much more within the group of radical right parties of Europe. So the anti-immigrant, real anti-rule of law parties of Western Europe. So Le Pen, the AfD in Germany, and so on. So that's where the Republican Party is today. And what's so striking about that is that those are systems in which you have a multi-party system, in which you already have a traditional center-right. What's frightening, and I think in our context, is that one of our two main parties is essentially a radical right party. And so, what's driving this, I think, is exactly some of the forces that you're pointing to. I mean, there are these deep social divisions, and the Republican Party, whereas the Democratic Party is a highly diverse party and reflects the diversity of American society, culturally, ethnically, and so on. A majority of Democratic voters, are there's mixtures of white. It's a rainbow coalition party. The Republican Party, by contrast, a majority of Republican voters, an overwhelming majority, remain white in a very diverse society. And so I think, given the kind of overlaying of our parties onto these cultural gaps, it's a very dangerous situation. I think one big solution going forward is the Republican Party ideally would diversify and become a much more diverse party. And it would be much harder to be a white nationalist party if you were an ethnically diverse party that could win in cities and not just in rural areas. And so I think these underlying social fractures are part of the thing that are exacerbating these tensions in our society.
Well, Daniel Ziblatt, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Yes. Yeah, good. Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
And again, I've been speaking with Daniel Ziblatt, who's a professor of government at Harvard University and director of the Transformations of Democracy group at the W.Z. Beach Berlin Social Science Center, where he studies Europe from the 19th century to the present. And he's the author of Conservative Parties and the Birth of Democracy. And his latest book, a New York Times bestseller, co-authored with Steven Livitskty, is How Democracies Die. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back looking at how the Federal Trade Commission in 46 states are suing to break up Facebook, accusing it of crushing competition.